Hey guys, it's Eric Manning, and joined here with Tyson James, who has been a chapter director for Reasonable Faith since 2013 and is now the organization's global chapters director. So I wanted to bring him on the show because I thought it would be a good idea to have somebody who just has overseen and and oversees a large group of apologists working all over the world. And working with different apologists, you probably had a lot of different opportunities to kind of mentor and encourage people and point them in the right direction. You've seen things that work well and see things that don't work well. And just being involved in the apologetics community for years, um, there's just a lot of sage wisdom that I thought you could drop on our audience there. And I've been working in apologetics kind of off and on myself, and so this is just going to be kind of more of a conversational time where Tyson and I just share some of the things that we've learned doing online ministry, as well as working out in the field face to face with people. And so, yeah, I'm just really excited to have you on. So thank you so much for joining me, Tyson.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. It's awesome. I've been following your YouTube channel since you first put it out, and you are just doing phenomenal work. Like the content is top shelf. So I think anybody out there who's looking for some really solid apologetics material really needs to check out the rest of your content.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate that. And as I always say, and maybe it sounds cliche to people, but if it's good, it's grace. And if there's any goofs, it's definitely on my side. And so, but yeah. Again, thanks so much for coming on. Now, how long have you been working with Reasonable Faith? I think I said it was since 2013. Is that right?
Yeah, so I started as a local chapter director like yourself in 2013. Started in Monterey, California, and my wife's in the military, so we've been bouncing around the country. We went to North Carolina for a while, and just last June we moved to Las Vegas. So yeah, settled in Las Vegas for now, and doing apologetics here has been a task, but great mission field. So I'm super excited about that. So yeah, I was a local chapter director starting in 2013, and then our executive director Michael Lapine, he let me know that the national chapters director was stepping down, and he had dropped my name as a possible replacement for him. So he asked me if I wanted the job, and I accepted. That was 2017. So that's when I became the supervisor of all of the chapters. And so, as of today, we have 226 chapters in 37 countries, six
Mm.
continents. So, we've really taken off over the past few years.
Yeah, definitely. And so, and again, you're just working with all kinds of different people, different personalities, and have probably seen a lot. And so, well, let's just talk about some of the different things that I've seen in the apologetics world, some of maybe the pitfalls. And what we want to give you guys is just some practical advice. This is going to be extremely practical. This channel, normally I'm talking about, historical evidence for the gospels and different things like that. But we're going to just kind of really get kind of where the rubber meets the road, and what maybe you've been interested in getting into the field of apologetics yourself, and you just kind of don't know exactly how to get started, or maybe you've been in apologetics for a while, and I've seen some things, some patterns with people, pitfalls, if you will, that people fall into and slip into, and we want to help you avoid those kind of things, because this is a ministry, and people are people, including ministers, including people who are working in the field of apologetics, and there's we have to contend with the world and our flesh and the devil, just like everybody else. And especially if you are trying to share the gospel and defend the faith, it's not something that we talk about a lot, but there are spiritual adversaries that are going to push your buttons. And they know you, they've been studying you, and they're going to push your buttons. And we don't want to be that apologist who just makes a fool of themselves in front of the world, or does something that you know definitely besmirches the name of Christ, if you will, but to use a fancy word, besmirch, that's fun to say. And so, anyways,
You get paid for those extra long words and fancy words.
yeah, yeah, that's what makes the AdSense revenue go way up there. And so, but anyways, one of the things that I've noticed, Tyson, and maybe you've noticed this as well, is Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8:3 that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And I think anytime that you become smarter than the average person in a particular field, and just really study a particular field, that it could really lend itself to pride, and your own pride can get in the way. Sometimes it's hard to be patient with other people who don't understand kind of what you're talking about and aren't on your level. And we can see that even with seasoned apologists. I won't name any particular names, but there's a certain Reformed apologist who loves mountain biking and Coogie sweaters that was involved with an incident kind of where he was belittling a person in the apologetics community for working at Dillard's. It's kind of like he sort of was poisoning the well against him because, after all, he's a Dillard's employee, and what would he know? And so, yeah. Have you? I'm sure you've probably noticed that. Maybe you've noticed it in your own life. How do we deal with that and keep that kind of thing under? What are your thoughts on that?
I think pride is one of those things that most apologists struggle with in one form or another. And it's so sinister because there are so many different forms that pride can take, some of them very subtle. And so sometimes it can be very difficult without self-reflection, constant self-reflection, to see in yourself where pride is manifesting itself. So we have high profile cases where pride is just very sort of obvious, but then there are other areas where it might not be so obvious. So one of the more obvious areas is just a sense of superiority due to having greater knowledge, right? That's just, so much more. And as soon as somebody is talking to you and they say something wrong, you're ready to pounce all over them for their error, right? And it takes a great deal of restraint and charity a lot of the times to gently correct people in a way that doesn't belittle them, doesn't make them feel stupid and just out of the conversation completely, right? We don't want to shut down conversation. We want people to know that maybe they don't have the correct answer, but it's out of love that we're sharing the correct information. So that's an obvious area of pride. And that's one that I've struggled with for a long time because I just had the opportunity to get a lot of education. So I have 2 associate's degrees, 2 bachelor's degrees, one of them a double major, and 2 master's degrees. That's far more education than a lot of people have. And that's still even less than Dr. Craig has with his 2 doctorates. And yet I feel like he's way more humble than I am. So there are people that you can look up to that really have displayed this humility that's should be characteristic of a good apologist. So I look up to Dr. Craig as a great example of that.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's that sense of superiority due to greater knowledge. And really overcoming that is just recognizing that you too were once at a point of lesser knowledge, and you know what it's like to be on that end of things. It's kind of like knowing that you were once unsaved, and so you have been redeemed by the blood of Christ, and so you shouldn't look down on people as morally inferior just because they are unsaved. So it's kind of like that same sense. You took time to get to this greater amount of knowledge, and so you should be patient with those with lesser knowledge. And so, yeah, that next sense I just touched on, a sense of moral superiority. That can be another aspect of pride. Just because you're an apologist, you're involved in this intellectual fight, that doesn't make you better than apologists or not apologists, but laity or even church leadership who aren't involved in apologetics. The church is a body with many members, and some members are equipped to engage in apologetics and others aren't. That doesn't make you morally superior if you are an apologist.
Yeah, definitely. So,
Yeah.
and so,
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, no, you go ahead. I didn't mean to jump in there.
No, I'm just gonna keep rambling, man. So go ahead and interrupt.
No, you're good. Anyway, so I just got to keep it awkward on the live streams. And so, hey, everybody, this is why I always script my videos. No, anyway, yeah,
Smash that like and subscribe button.
yeah. And so, oh man, yeah, the YouTube cliches. And so, I think going back to some of the stuff that I was saying earlier, when you have like multiple degrees, and this is one thing that I want to kind of encourage people is, just because you see people with like a lot of different degrees and different things like that, you shouldn't necessarily allow yourself to be intimidated by somebody just because of their credentials, and kind of let them like credential shame you into silence. And so not only do we have to like manage our own pride, just because, I think of that Ron Swanson clip where he's in the Lowe's or whatever, and he's like, I know more than you. Don't let that kind of come back on you, to where somebody just, like I said, credential shames you into where like, oh, I don't have that advanced degree. Maybe I don't have the ability to say what I'm saying here. There's a quote by Tim McGrew, who was kind of like my early mentor in apologetics, that I thought was really good. Is he says, an advanced degree is indirect evidence that you know what you're talking about. It's useful as far as it goes, but indirect evidence must give way in the presence of direct evidence. Show me that you know what you're talking about, and I don't care whether or not you have the degree. Show me that you don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care whether you have the degree. And so, don't allow somebody else's pride, like I said, to shame you, because there are things that you can learn. There's so many different ways in this day and age, to pick up knowledge and get the things. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, more as we go along. But it can kind of be a double-edged thing where somebody's pride can try to shove you in a corner.
Right. Yeah, it's two sides of the same coin. We got to be on guard for our own pride, and also be discerning when we are facing people who are prideful, and not allow their credentialism to undermine what we know to be true, just because of the title or status or education that they have. And we see this in the popular culture all the time now, where people who have some type of expertise are given, this sort of authority by the culture to speak on things that are far outside of their purview, right?
Right.
Scientists making moral judgments on particular issues when they're not ethicists, right? Maybe they're really good at what they do in a particular scientific field, but they're novices when it comes to ethics or logic or philosophy. And so we see this all the time in the popular sphere, and it's something that we really have to be on guard about.
Yeah, for sure. And so, all right. Anything else, Tyson, on pride before we move on to some of the other pitfalls and issues there that we've
Yeah, just
seen?
a couple more things. So a couple more senses of pride. One of them would be a sense of superiority due to title or one's status. So, just because you have some type of title under your belt, like you're a president of something, or you have so many formal debates under your belt, or you've published so many books, you have some type of status, that doesn't mean that you should consider yourself greater than those around you. I've known people that haven't really achieved any sort of title or status, and yet they are phenomenal apologists because they've put their noses to the grind, and they're just autodidacts who teach themselves everything, and they're just constantly learning and pushing themselves to greater knowledge and understanding. And so I've seen people who are very humble, who just haven't achieved that title or status, who are far better apologists than people who kind of lean on that status that they've achieved in a lot of people's eyes.
Yeah.
And then the last sort of sense of pride that I see is a sense of independence from the church.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's a big one.
I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but there is a sense among some apologists that they are somehow apart from or separate from the church. You've got the
Hmm.
church who is dealing with people on an emotional level, and then you've got the apologists who are dealing with the outside world on an intellectual level. And
Hmm.
that's just a completely incorrect way of looking at things. Apologists have to be an integral part of a healthy body of believers. There is no such thing as a good apologist that stands apart from the
Right.
church.
Absolutely.
So, we see this a lot in our field where there are apologists who kind of go rogue. They're not involved in churches. They
Hmm.
kind of have their own ministries, and they get a great following, or maybe a lot of people know them, but spiritually, they're not actually contributing to a local body and drawing from that source of spiritual encouragement and strength. So, yeah, I think that is a sense of pride that a lot of apologists struggle with, is not being part of the church. And that's a shame, because
Yeah.
really, apologists should be some of the most involved people in the
Hmm.
church these days. I mean, how many churches do we see that have apologetics integrated from cradle to grave, right? Everybody needs this information, and we just don't see enough of that in the church today. That's one of the struggles that we have, is finding ways to incorporate what we do into all aspects of the church.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that I saw, this was, I think it was on social media, and I don't remember who it was. And so, if I'm talking about you and you're watching, and I'm not thinking of anybody necessarily in particular, but I saw somebody who was kind of like church hopping a little bit, because as they grew in apologetics knowledge, they all of a sudden thought, well, my pastor, he's just not really feeding me spiritually like I need to be fed. And I'm thinking, like, if your pastor is giving you the gospel every Sunday and he's giving you practical teaching on how to live out your faith, it doesn't matter that he's not talking about apologetics necessarily every Sunday from the pulpit. It, you need to the practical, normal sheep food, just like anybody else. Just because your pastor doesn't, know the Greek and the Hebrew and all of this other stuff, and maybe even makes the occasional mistake in maybe his reasoning, in some of the things that he says, that all of a sudden, just because you've kind of grown in knowledge, suddenly he's not feeding you. It's just like that. I I'm not saying that's totally impossible, but that is a really big red flag for me. It sounds to me like some of your knowledge is going to your head, and all of a sudden, you need something more, than what you was working for you just fine, up until you got really heavy into apologetics or philosophy or different things like that. So does that make sense? You know what I'm saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go to that point, about, a pastor who's feeding you this regular food and possibly making an error, maybe one of the purposes of you being in the church and involved is to help point those things out
Right.
lovingly and in a brotherly way. I've done that. And I've been that guy where, I go up to the pastor afterwards and I say, hey, let me ask you a question about this. And, there was some clarification made and a sharpening, right?
Right.
So that can only help the church if you're coming at it that way. So you can be a benefit to the local church just by being there and listening and participating. It doesn't mean that, it is difficult when you're in a church and you can tell that the level of teaching is very low. That is a struggle for a lot of apologists, and it's discouraging, and it's difficult for a lot of us. But on the flip side, if the level is low and it's a burden on your heart that the level of discourse at the church, or the level of learning at the church, needs to get higher, then maybe God is calling you to be a teacher.
Right.
Maybe God is calling you to be a mentor to the leaders. And so that's part of what we do as apologists, is try and fit in where the Lord wants us in the local church.
Yeah, exactly. And just another thing, boy, we could go on this forever, but like I said, this is conversational. So if we bounce all over the place, that's totally fine. We're not sticking to a particular script or anything here. But um, be involved in just practical stuff. I, I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm not saying, hey, look at me, I'm great, I'm wonderful. But I've been in the two same departments in my local church for over a decade in sound and as an usher. And so I've scrubbed floors. I've washed toilets. My wife's on the cleaning team. I help her out. I've worked at my church's before and after school program, working with kids. And so just because would love to be hitting the books and doing a lot of things that are intellectual, doesn't mean that I'm above, doing very, very practical things of service. And so, boy, we could just harp on that all night. And so, but I'm going to move to the next point here. One thing that I notice with a lot of apologists, and maybe people who are maybe more new to the field, or not necessarily new, maybe just they always just tend to favor the arguments that support our position, and to the point where they could let their own biases maybe get in the way and become uncritical of arguments that favor our position. And we should be able to do some in-house critiques of when an argument is maybe being put forward by somebody, even if it's somebody who's popular, even if it's somebody who has kind of a big name in the apologetics community. We ought to be able to critique those arguments and offer, other alternatives, perhaps, without taking offense or different things like that. Or, some of the things that I've seen just kind of online is if you critique certain apologists, somebody will be like, whoa, now, no, don't. You shouldn't really talk about your brother that way. And it's like, well, I'm not talking about the person. I'm just saying the argument could be better. And so I don't know if you've had that experience where maybe we are too overly eager to be accepting of our own arguments that favor our position. And then when there's any pushback that comes back on some of those arguments, all of a sudden you're like, what are you, not on the team anymore? And I think that's a very unhealthy and brittle thing. And I think unbelievers and skeptics, they see that and they're like, that's kind of, that's not a good sign. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And one of the difficult things about this particular point is that a lot of people, when they dip into apologetics for the first time, they find an argument or two that is really attractive to them, and it bolsters their confidence in the faith. And now they're ready to go out and share the gospel in a way that they've never done before. And so it's very hard to sometimes separate the soundness of that argument or the strength of that argument from the feeling that you got initially when you first learned it and it gave you that confidence. And so that's, I think, why a lot of people get complacent, and it becomes more difficult as time goes by to objectively look at those arguments and test them for strength and add new information that might force us to tweak them and adjust them a little bit. One analogy that I think is really helpful here is like the evolution of cars, where as they went on, there were new features added that really increased the utility of the cars, the power, the speed at which they went, the handling, the comfort of the ride. And so more and more features were added, and also more testing for safety, right? Because as more people drove cars, more people got in wrecks. And so in mass production, you want to make sure that these cars are very safe for people to drive. Apologetics arguments are a lot like this. You want fast vehicles, vehicles that are very powerful and can get people from point A to point B very quickly, but also you want them to be safe, because if you're just launching arguments out there that are not actually sound, then you're actually going to do more harm in the long run than helping people.
Yeah.
So the stakes are really high here. I mean, we're talking about people's salvation and also their confidence in the faith if they're already saved. And so if there are arguments that you're really putting out forcefully that people are accepting but aren't really sound and could be strengthened, that can be detrimental. And so we really want to put our own arguments through a lot of rigorous testing, a lot of peer review, to continually sharpen them and make them as solid as we can for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you really find an argument that you really like, you need to hear the best of what's said against it.
Yeah.
I mean, if I encourage people. Now, I'm not saying that like you should just dive headlong into reading Graham Oppie right at first, until you've been able to build the positive case in you, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on here. But if you find an argument that you really like a lot, read the best criticisms that you can against it, and really try and play devil's advocate. Don't just push something out there because you heard one person say it with a lot of confidence and you're like, oh, that sounds really good. Find out, even the criticism, and get criticism from, I mean, you might be surprised where you can find the criticism. It might be from, I used to think like one good way to argue against Jesus mythicism is talk about Josephus, because, Josephus mentions Jesus in a couple of different places. And I don't think Richard Carrier is right that both of the passages about Josephus are total interpolations about Jesus. But on the other hand, he does at least raise enough questions to where like, well, maybe this isn't as clear cut as I thought it was. And at best, all this shows is that it just confirms what Christians in the first century believed about Jesus, which really, big whoop-de-doo, that doesn't really get you very far. Maybe I need to talk about other sources. And so that's just like one example from my own personal life where I just was like, I used to think, this is a pretty good argument if I'm going to talk with a mythicist. And I'm like, this is probably one of the weakest arguments that I could trot out there. And so, yeah.
And that's a great point, is we don't necessarily need to only have criticism from inside the Christian camp, right? We can be in conversation with people who are learned and are competent in logic and philosophy, who aren't Christians, who can take a look at our arguments and let us know whether or not there are things that we can tighten up. So like you said, Richard Carrier, he's no friend of Christianity, but the things that he's put forward has forced Christians to sharpen their arguments a lot.
Yeah. And I used him just as kind of an example because he's normally somebody who I'm like, Richard Carrier, like not the strongest critic of Christianity. I mean, Richard Carrier thinks he might be one of the strongest critics of Christianity. He's kind of, well, anyways, I won't go there, but not who I think would be the strongest. That would be more like Paul Draper or Graham Oppie or something like that. But the fact is that we can learn from everybody. You could learn from the guy, in your own, in sometimes even in YouTube comments or Twitter. If they're bringing a question against an argument, don't just toss it out because it's just a guy that's on YouTube or Twitter leaving a comment. Like, maybe ask yourself, do they have a point?
Yeah. And, Dr. Craig himself, like, if you want to, see somebody who people look up to as a paradigmatic apologist, he's continually sharpening his arguments. And, even he notes that it's necessary for each generation to update and revise the apologetics arguments that we use in light of new developments. The Kalam cosmological argument, the argument that he's most famous for, he's even offered a new formulation of that based on some comments that people have made regarding the causal principle. So, we don't need to be afraid of that, right? We're fallible human beings. We're constantly trying to, with more and more knowledge, gain a stronger understanding of the world. And that's going to cause us to review our arguments in light of this new information that we get. And that's a great thing, because we have a confidence that all truth is God's truth. And so as we gain knowledge of God's revelation, we should be modifying our views in light of new information.
Yeah, we should welcome it. And so just underscoring the point, good point here from a person in the chat, Theophilus Sogoromo. I hope I said that. I see him leave comments here on the channel every now and then. Always appreciate it. Insightful guy. He says, my biggest frustration with Christian apologists is they tend to straw man arguments from non-believers. And so my tip to aspiring apologists would be to steel man the arguments. And so I think it just definite underscores just kind of exactly what we were saying here. So excellent comment there.
Yeah, I will say to that, one of the interesting ways to practice not straw manning your opponent's argument is to get into a devil's advocate debate. So take the position of your opponent in a just a funsy debate and try and characterize their view as strongly as possible, and see if they would agree that you have characterized their view fairly. I did that with an atheist friend of mine, and he actually admitted, he was like, "You're a better defender of atheism than I am." So yeah, that's one way to, and you'll, preparing for a position, no matter what side you're on in a debate, will force you to learn more about that position. So that's just a really interesting way to go about learning how to steel man your opponent.
Yeah. If you can make other apologists uncomfortable with your knowledge of and arguments for atheism or a different position, then you're probably on the right track. And so even though it might make us uncomfortable, it should make us stronger. And so this kind of ties into the next point that I've noticed here. And this is something that I think a lot of people have fallen for. I've fallen for at the first, maybe a little bit. And so is the Dunning. Boy, look at that stuttering there. The Dunningkruger, I'll get it out here, effect, which is just basically like you have a surface level knowledge where you end up thinking that you know more than you really do. And I think I made a meme one time where, I don't know if you've seen the one with it was Trump's son, and he's got like a T-shirt that says "The Expert." And it was like, when you've read On Guard for the first time, and so or maybe you've read the Case for Christ, and man, you're going to go out there, by golly, and you're going to bludgeon people to death on Facebook with your newfound knowledge from reading some entry-level apologetics. And so I think that's
Bart Ehrman. Here we go.
Yeah, bring on Bart, bring him on. And so I think that just kind of ties into what we've already been saying, is watch out for that. Like, don't think that just because you have a little bit of knowledge, you need to go beyond the surface knowledge and really get into, I don't know, reading some of the top flight atheist philosophers and different things like that before you really jump out there all at once. So
there's a phrase that we used in the South. I grew up in Arkansas, so I'm gonna draw on my southernness here. You probably can't tell by my accent. I don't know why I didn't come away with the southern accent growing up in Arkansas, but anyway, so there was a phrase, I know enough to be dangerous, right? Somebody asks you, if you know something, you say, I know enough to be dangerous. And so what this phrase means is like, when somebody has this sort of basic competency in doing or knowing something, but isn't an expert, and that person just knowing a little bit can potentially make mistakes that might have really bad consequences. So that is true of all fields, no matter what. And definitely apologetics, you're dealing with some pretty dire consequences. You're talking about people struggling in the faith potentially, Christians in church. And if you are terrible at apologetics and you offer some really terrible information or advice, that can send people into a spiral. I've seen it happen. So this is just a really difficult problem to overcome, really. And that's because it requires the person who has Dunningkruger to acknowledge that they aren't yet knowledgeable enough to warrant the confidence that they have. Right. But how do you have that type of, self-awareness, right? You're in that moment, you think you have enough knowledge, and the knowledge gives you the confidence. So how are you supposed to overcome that confidence? That's really difficult. And one of the reasons that it manifests is, I think, something that we already touched on. And that is that a lot of apologists develop in isolation. They're not integrated into a community of more experienced apologists, or
Mm-hmm.
just people who are more mature in general, who
Mm-hmm.
can point out that maybe they are overconfident given the amount of knowledge that they have.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, and it just goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, is pride, right? And so it's humility. The more I learn about this stuff, the more I realize there's a lot I don't know. And that's a safer place to be for sure. And so you want to always be aware that like there is a lot of people out there that know a whole lot more than you. And you don't want to just kind of hang out at the shallow end of things. As an apologist, you should always be striving to learn. And so, got a quick super chat. I'm going to deviate just a little bit here, and I'm going to let you answer this one, Tyson. It says, this is from Vols Kalma. If I got your pronunciation wrong, I apologize.
Voskalma.
Voskalma. And so I'm a new Christian in Minnesota. Seems to have a reasonable faith chapter, but I can't tell how active it is. If you were starting over from scratch today, would you just visit a bunch of churches until you like one? So I guess this person's trying to find a church that suits them. And so, Tyson, since you've moved around a lot as well, among just working and helping and serving in different churches, what is your advice on finding like a good church?
Yeah. So Voskalma says that they are in Minnesota, and so our chapter there is in Minneapolis. The chapter director there is Phil Lane, great guy. So I really hope you get connected with Phil. You can contact him at phil.lane@reasonablefaith.org, and I'm sure he would be happy to connect with you. But yeah, so like Eric said, I've moved around a lot. So everywhere I go, I have to kind of start over with finding a good church and getting connected. And so my general practice is, first of all, my advice is that you have to know where you stand on doctrine in order to even begin finding a church that you think will be suitable. If you're not settled on what you believe in the first place, then you're really just kind of throwing a dart in the dark, because no church is going to be better than another to you. For me, I want to find a Protestant evangelical church that affirms, the sort of mere Christianity model, doctrine of salvation, that is salvation by faith alone in Christ. So yeah, I will pull up on Google just a list of churches in my area, and then I'll go through and look at the statement of faith of each of those churches. And that narrows down for me the churches that I think are good and churches that I think aren't good based on doctrine. That's the very first thing. A church can have good doctrine on a website, though, and not necessarily be preaching it when you go there. So another thing is you actually have to go and visit some churches. And so for me, that is another process. I'll visit dozens of churches before I settle on one. And so if I'm hearing, solid exegesis from the pulpit or solid handling of scripture, and I'm talking to people and they have a love for the Lord, and it seems like a healthy church, then that's a potential. Also, I have a daughter, so somewhere where she can get plugged in and somewhere that my wife feels comfortable. Those are also important factors. So those are the main things to me: is doctrine, what's being taught at the church, and the people there at the church. You can just kind of get a feel talking to them how the church is, and then also my family and how they are considering the church.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I would just say pretty much amen to all of that. For me, I guess I've just been fortunate. I've been at the same church for the last 20 years. And then before that, I had only been at like a couple other churches before, and I just had like a sense where I just belong there. And if you pray and if you ask God to lead you and guide you and direct you, and you're expecting Him to do that, He will. And so it says in 1 Corinthians 12:18 that God has set every member in the body where it has pleased Him. And so if you feel pleased on the inside, and I'm not talking about some weird woo-woo kind of sense or something like that, but if you sense that the Lord is pleased with you being there, you trust that instinct, and because He does promise that His Spirit will lead us and guide us in all truth. And so that would just be my kind of maybe super spiritual sounding advice there. But no, excellent question, and thank you
Let me
both.
just add two real quick, Eric.
Yeah,
You know, I wouldn't also get so hung up on finding the perfect church right away.
right.
We're all constantly developing in our walk with God and in our theology. And so it may be that you start attending a church that you feel connected to, but as you grow in the Lord, you finally, you realize, well, maybe this church, they're not preaching the gospel, or they're not handling a particular issue in the church like they should. And so maybe I need to find another congregation. That's okay, right? The
Mhm.
Lord has really set things up in our day and age where it's possible to be connected to a church, and then you growing and then finding that that church isn't where you need to be. And so
Mhm.
there are other options.
Yeah,
So, it's difficult when you get plugged in and you become an integral part to leave and go to a new place. But ultimately, we want to serve the Lord and be at peace in our spirits that we are connected to a body of believers who are honoring Him. And if that means finding a new congregation, then that might be a need too.
yeah, yeah. And so, like I said, just be in prayer, and He will definitely put you in the right place. And Rose, I do want to say this: you're my very first super chat. So I don't do a ton of live streams, and so thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And so other pitfalls that I've found with apologetics, and this is something that I really have to watch out for, is there's always so much to learn, and there's always so much to do and be involved with. And if we're not careful, we can end up spending like almost too much time where like our all of our extra time could just be on apologetics, and we can neglect our own spiritual life. We can neglect our own devotional life. And so, what are some of the good habits that an apologist should have as far as like spiritual habits?
Oh yeah. So I would just, broadly, the healthiest apologists that I know have found a great balance between regular devotions. I'm talking about prayer, reading their Bibles, um, attending to their involvement in the church, and also their family. So if God has placed responsibilities in your life that you are deprioritizing because of apologetics,
Mhm.
like family, like career, like serving other people in other capacities, then you're not going to be um, fulfilling your purpose in the way that God wants you to. You're not going to be a healthy apologist. So,
Yeah.
um, people that are obsessed with learning in the very beginning, that's very common in apologetics because there is so much to learn, like you said. It's understandable. Like, I get it. I was there. When I started in on it, like I was just voracious. I was watching, debate videos all the time. I was reading as much as I possibly could. I wanted to know everything I possibly could, and it can be unhealthy. And
Yeah.
so you really have to pull back, give yourself some time to digest, and also engage in these other spiritual disciplines so that you can be a healthy apologist.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, for
Go
sure.
ahead.
Oh no, I was just thinking all of a sudden the passages in Revelation where it says he said that let me just read it. Let's see, I just pulled it up here. Let me scroll up. says, I know your deeds, your hard work, your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, and have tested those who claim to be apostles, but are not, and found them false. You've persevered, endured hardships, but have not grown weary. But yet this I hold against you, you've forsaken your first love. See how far you've fallen, repent and do the things that you did at first. And so, but I notice here that he talks about testing those who claim to be apostles but are not, which would probably have some apologetic kind of impact. You're testing things according to the doctrine, and you're trying to answer people who are peddling wrong doctrine. But if that's all you're doing is spending your time on that, and the Lord is like, hey, like, you don't love me as much as you did at first. You're spending all of your time on this, where before, when you first became a Christian, you had that freshness in your faith. You were spending time in prayer. You were spending time being thankful. You were reading your Bible. You were excited to be at church. And now you're just thinking like, you're just kind of going through the motions and doing these things because I guess I need to do these things to be a good Christian. Or maybe you're just ignoring them altogether and you're just studying philosophy all the time. You are going to become that prideful person, that obnoxious person, because you're not really guarding your heart. You're not really tending to your own spiritual life and developing like you should. And you're going to end up being that sounding brass and that tinkling cymbal that Paul talks about. And so this is just something that you just really got to watch. Take the time, to pray. It sounds cliche, but take a walk, talk to God, be open and honest with him, ask him to help you deal with these things. Talk to him about what's important to you, what's on your heart. Pray for the things that he talks to you in his word about praying about, and just keep a hungry heart for the word of God, because if you don't have those things, what good is it to do a bunch of apologetics when this life eventually is going to come to nothing, and he's going to be like, hey, you did all this stuff, but you didn't do it out of love, and you didn't hardly have much of a relationship with me. That sounds like a really scary kind of situation to be in.
Yeah. And it's kind of understandable why people slip into this, because you see the need for apologetics, right? There's an urgency.
Mhm.
People need to hear the reasons for the truth of the faith. Unbelievers, because they don't have Christ, and maybe they're struggling intellectually, and maybe this will bring them to Christ.
Mhm.
And believers, because maybe they're struggling with doubts, and so you want to help them have confidence in Christ. And so you're trying to gather this knowledge as much as possible because you want to help people. That's great. But like anything, the good of apologetics can really be twisted into something bad by it becoming an unhealthy priority,
Mhm.
right? It's like fire. Fire can be great for cooking, right? Or, a combustion engine, right? It can power a car, but it can also set a wildfire. And so if you're not careful with it, it can get out of control.
Yeah,
So I've
absolutely.
seen the pendulum swing both ways. I've seen people who were so obsessed with learning that they don't actually practice apologetics. Like they will learn apologetics, but they will hide behind their books because they're afraid of actually interacting with people.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's one way to spend too much time on apologetics. And on the other side, there are people who are so obsessed with doing apologetics that they neglect additional learning. Like we were talking about, they become uncritical of how much they know. Maybe they have Dunningkruger, they're overconfident, or maybe they're not being critical enough with the arguments that they're using, and could potentially have stronger arguments, but they don't know that because they're neglecting additional learning. And
Mhm.
so there are people on both sides. They are too obsessed with learning or too obsessed with doing apologetics. And then there are people who are so obsessed with both learning and doing apologetics that they neglect the other responsibilities that we were talking about that God has put before them.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of potential pitfalls there. And so striving for that balance, not putting apologetics too high on the priority list, making sure that you have a robust relationship with God is going to help you become the apologist that you need to be to represent Christ effectively through your apologetics.
Definitely. Absolutely. So, um, other pitfalls that I find that I thought we could touch on, wasting time. Boy, I did this one. And so it is really easy to kind of hang out at the shallow end of the pool intellectually, so to speak. There could be TikTok. Um, there could be YouTube comment sections.
You're
Please,
stepping on a lot of toes right now, man.
yeah, please comment though. I'm not saying don't comment, people. It helps the algorithm. Please comment, and I do appreciate it when you guys engage. But don't waste time in the comment section. When it's you can obviously see it's not going anywhere. Facebook, Twitter's a very big one. I personally had to step away from Twitter mostly because I like it, and I like it a little bit too much. And then there's also the fact that it's just like, what what am I actually getting out of spending this time? And so it's really easy to kind of hang out at that shallow end, and it just, you end up spinning your wheels, talking to people, which some of it can be good, and there might be some good that comes out of it. But I think what I was doing in my case was I was taking some of that good and then justifying spending more time on it than I should. When really, on the overall balance of things, it was not something that was necessarily beneficial. And so, how do we find like the most fruitful ways to get involved in apologetics and not getting like too involved with the online stuff? Because with online, it's so easy to just jump on there and you can just start an argument and a conversation at the click of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I'm one of the most guilty of this. Early on, before I was connected to Reasonable Faith, I was just learning apologetics. Like, I would get online, and I'm going to show my age here, but I was getting on like Craigslist forums a lot. And there's a, there was a religion forum, and I would get on there all the time and just get into arguments. And that was really the way I cut my teeth on, trying out different arguments for the existence of God, and answering objections and things like that. Apologetics is one of those things where you do need to practice, like getting out there and having conversations. So the online world is a great tool for that. But again, it's that over prioritization of apologetics that can really be unhealthy. And so if you're not spending enough time studying, if you're not spending enough time in the other spiritual disciplines, getting connected to your church, it really is going to detract from your health as an apologist. We were talking on the last point about spending too much time on apologetics. One thing that I didn't bring up was that apologists need some exercise occasionally, like keyboard warrior type stuff. You're just kind of sedentary at a computer. Like Jonathan Pritchett, he'll be really happy I mentioned this, but I think apologists need to be more healthy physically too. So that might mean like actually getting up and going and taking a walk, or going to the gym, or like just doing some jumping jacks every once in a while. Like, you need to be healthy holistically, and not just, have an overwhelming apologetic case all the time. Like, get out there and get some exercise every once in a while too.
Yeah.
But yeah, go. So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna drop a lame pastor joke. My pastor would joke around, and he's like, I'm just growing in the role of the ministry, but it was more referencing fat rolls. It's one of those really cheesy pastor jokes that I think every pastor tells. And so, but yeah, I definitely have some extra. For all the grief that I was giving a certain Coogie wearing apologist earlier, I think it's actually pretty cool because he was not always in really good shape, and that man can marathon around on that bike of his. And I thought, man, he's like in way better shape than I am, and he's probably at least 20 years older than me. And I'm in my 40s, and so I'm just thinking like, yeah, I gotta do something about this. It's when you're a stay-at-home dad of 5 kids, helping your wife run a business, it's real easy to kind of neglect some of those things. And so,
well, 5 kids, that's built-in exercise. You're good to go, man.
Yeah, I guess that's true. So I could always, I have done that before. You get the baby, put him on the shoulders, and do a few squats. And so,
yeah, good for a little bench press.
Yeah, everybody's having fun. So,
yeah. So yeah, going back to wasting time, like it's really easy to, when you've reached a certain level, to just be content with lounging in the shallows. where the waters are really calm and easy to navigate, right? And for some who really don't have a lot of aptitude, that's okay.
Mhm.
You can only go so far, a lot of that is kind of the Lord's doing, right? He put you in a certain time and place, and maybe you just don't have the aptitude to go very deep. That's
Mhm.
okay. But for those who actually do have a greater ability, um, refusing to get out of the shallows, I think, can actually be a dereliction of duty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, like, God has given some of us gifts for delving more deeply
Mhm.
and helping those who need more sophisticated answers.
Yeah.
And for us to not take that aptitude and go deeper and just hang out where it's comfortable is doing a disservice to those who need our help.
Yeah.
And so I would just encourage you, if you, if you've been in apologetics for a while and you're just in a comfort zone, just kind of push yourself out of that. Maybe
Mhm.
talk to some people who have been in longer than you and have more education than you, and ask them, hey, what are some resources that you could suggest that could push me a little more deeper into this?
Yeah.
um, I mean, it goes really, really deep, and not everyone is an expert on all subjects, right? So maybe you've really mastered a particular argument for the existence of God, or a particular line of reasoning. There
Mhm.
are so many other lines that you have not mastered that you can go out and go deeper in.
Yeah.
So that's all of us. We're all constantly learning. There's more than you could ever learn in a lifetime, so you should never be actually complacent in the amount of knowledge that you have of
Yeah.
apologetics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I even noticed myself when I was spending too much time on there, it's like I'm getting kind of like flabby apologetics wise. I'm not as sharp because I'm not reading as much. I'm not studying as much as I should be. I'm too busy, arguing with, some guy on Twitter or something like that. Like this isn't good. I'm neglecting becoming a better apologist by spending a bunch of time doing this, and I'm also probably taking time from other more important things like my family and different things like that. You got 5 kids. How much time do you really have for Twitter? So, and I think about while you were talking about the whole dereliction of duty thing, I thought about John McCrae, the What Do You Mean channel.
Yeah.
Like the whole reason he got started in the first place is he was just, I think he had something with his hearing or something. He was spending a
Hmm.
bunch of time online, and he had a friend who's like, dude, you should be doing more with this than just arguing with people online. Like, and he was just like, whatever, dude. He's like, no, you should be on YouTube. And then I guess the guy eventually sent him like equipment and like invested in him starting a YouTube channel. And I mean, look at where he's at right now, where he's influencing a lot of people for the gospel, just doing like cultural type of apologetics, which is probably his fit, and it just kind of goes to something else that we'll be talking about. And I don't want to take too much of your time. So, but finding your fit, finding what you're good at, and that's like he's found his niche, and so
Yeah.
I definitely admire him for that. I did want to read a quick quote again. I'm going to plug Tim McGrew again. Just this is a really good quote that I've saved from an email a long time ago, and I hope he doesn't mind me reading this. But it's online arguments are not a good training ground for someone who does not have experience. Stay away from them completely until you have studied deeply, and even then, don't just dive into every argument headlong. He says, this is the hardest piece of advice for most young people to accept, but it is one of the most important. I know how it feels to want to save the world, to stand up to the intellectual bully on Twitter or YouTube or some chat board. But if that's all you do, you will fritter away years in the intellectual shallow end. You'll at best be a playground hero, and sometimes you'll get your nose bloodied and look like a fool. Take the long view instead. Begin training now for serious battles, and when they come up, in the mercy of God, you will be ready for them. And then he goes on to say, if you can find a mentor to whom you can look up to, as more as just your intellectual superior, someone who can bring spiritual wisdom and godly counsel, as well as sound scholarship and wide learning, it will change your life almost inconceivably. Perhaps there is no one in your life right now who could play that role. If that's the case, begin to pray earnestly for God to bring that person. And so, lot of juicy nuggets in there. But yeah, it's just don't be the playground hero, because And you even see this with YouTube. It's like this constant, I got to respond to this person and I got to respond to that person. And I respond when I feel like it's worth responding to. And I sometimes respond when people respond to me, but sometimes I just choose not to because it's just not worth my time and energy when I could be furthering the case and answering those questions that they raised against maybe an argument that I brought up in a video indirectly, because I have a long-term goal in mind to bring about a large cumulative case. And if I just spent my time responding to every person who made a video about me, that would take a lot of time and energy away from building that positive case, which is going to answer that question down the road anyways. And so it's just, I think it again can go to the pride thing where it's just like there's this like like you calling me yellow there McFly. And so it's just like you don't necessarily have to answer every challenge and be that playground hero. So anything you wanted to add there, Tyson, before we move on?
Yeah, what Tim said is absolutely right. And the first thing he said right out of the gate was online is no place for somebody who is inexperienced. You shouldn't just be going out and picking fights if you aren't experienced already in understanding the apologetics landscape. And so that's why I'm so thankful for organizations like Reasonable Faith that have set up a community of apologists that can work together to sharpen each other, to draw on each other's experience and to sharpen one another in community. We have our Reasonable Faith chapter directors Facebook group where we're constantly sharing ideas and tossing arguments back and forth and debriefing when we have conversations and asking each other, hey, what's the best way to approach this certain issue? There are guys in there that have been part of Reasonable Faith for more than 10 years and have been doing apologetics for way longer than that. Those are great resources for younger apologists to draw on. And if you're not part of a community, then it's really hard to get that sort of good mentorship, that good discipleship. And so organizations like Reasonable Faith, there are other apologetics organizations that are developing their chapters programs coming up. I know Stand to Reason has a chapters program that they're developing. Cross-Examined is developing one as well. Reasons to Believe has a chapters program, I believe. And so even outside of those organizations, groups like the Christian Apologetics Alliance, if you want to get connected there, Tim is pretty active there and always willing to interact with people who want to reach out to him. So there's just so many great resources and communities to be a part of where you can get that sort of mentorship that's important for training before you get onto the battleground. I was in the military, and we have to go through basic training before we ever get to our training for our job. And then we do the training for our job, and then we go do our job. Everybody has to go through that first training, because if you get out there without any training, you're going to just be in people's way and do more harm than good. So same thing with apologetics.
Definitely. Here's Bram. Hey, Bram. Good to see you, man. And so talk about an up-and-coming apologist. This we'll have Bram hopefully on a future show talking about the cognitive dissonance, and did the resurrection come about because of cognitive dissonance, and were people expecting? I hope Bram doesn't mind me saying this. And did
cat's out of the bag now.
The cat's out of the bag now, Bram. And talking about that kind of whole theory that people have, and they were expecting Jesus to come back in their lifetime and they were wrong. And so we're going to be talking about that. But Bram says here, that's why I quit TikTok. Excellent choice, Bram. I and maybe a boomer side, showing my boomer side here, but I have tried TikTok like 3 different times. And every time I get on that app, I am just like, what in the world is this? This is the most obnoxious app. I don't know what's going on here. I will say this, like, I really appreciate like people like Red Pen Logic being on there, Tim Barnett, and I really appreciate Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, being on there. And like, if you haven't seen Mike Jones's, at least I'm thankful that he re-uploads some of them to YouTube. You see the craziest, bump my mic there. You see the craziest and dumbest things on there, but these guys also add a lot of value in other ways, and they're seasoned, and they're out there for a reason. And so they're not just like, well, I read a little bit here and I'm going to throw myself out. They're these decisions of those guys being out there is a lot more calculated than I think a lot of apologists. And yeah, TikTok is just a crazy place there. So, all right. Well, there are a few more things that I want to cover here. And then like I said, I don't want to keep you too long here, but this is a question. Actually, somebody had a really good question that kind of segues into this. Let me find it real quick. Now, whole life. How can I use apologetics to build the kingdom? I asked this as a youth with a deep passion for an understanding of apologetics. Where and how can I serve? I also ask as an introvert. And so how does somebody who is introverted get into the game? How does somebody, and this is just kind of ties into one of the questions that I wanted to ask. A lot of people, they can learn apologetics, but they never really get out of the books and onto the field. And so how can they get in the game, Tyson?
Well, first, I think this is the same Nahoa that was interviewed by Sean McDowell back in the day. Just
Really?
a young guy. Yeah. And Dr. Craig was actually very impressed by him because of how well spoken and how knowledgeable he was of his own work. So yeah, great. He did a great job with Sean in that interview, and I hope he's continuing his learning and being mentored by other apologists in his walk. Because getting started at that young an age, I can't even imagine how powerful an instrument he is going to be for the next generation of apologists out there. So look forward to his trajectory. But yeah, so he says, how can I use apologetics to build the kingdom? Asking as a youth with a deep passion for an understanding of apologetics. Where and how can I serve? So that's a great question. First of all, you can just be an integral part of the church. Being somebody who people come to know as reputable in knowledge can offer them a place, a source for comfort when they are confronted by troubles, intellectual troubles, but from objections they might have faced in their everyday lives. I've been in churches where apologetics wasn't really a priority or a focus or even really accepted. But because I was participating in Bible studies and asking good questions and just had a reputation of somebody who was familiar with apologetics, people would come to me and ask me questions because they knew that I had that competency. So as a young person, you might not be looked on as somebody who can teach a class or can train other people in apologetics, but you can continue to be in the church a source of strength for others just by gaining knowledge and leading your life as someone who is dependable, as having those answers when called upon.
Yeah, definitely. As somebody who's an introvert myself, I mean, I would say start working on writing. It's easy to start a blog, even if you just write things just strictly for yourself at first, and then maybe submit them to other people. Become part of a group, and there are places we can maybe make those kind of suggestions to where you can kind of run your thoughts and ideas past people. But as somebody I consider myself to be very, very introverted. Writing is a very good place to start. And it seems like a lot of people who are more introverted, that is like a very comfortable first step to get into. And so I would just definitely recommend start writing things, sharing them with others. If you're on Sean McDowell's channel and Dr. Craig is impressed with what you have to say, obviously follow what you feel is is right and how you feel God is leading you. But I would not be afraid to maybe step out, start a blog, even if it's just something where you write once a month and just share your thoughts, because it's just kind of like a good outlet, and you never know how that might take off. The whole reason I'm doing this channel right now is because I felt a sense, a drawing to start writing, and I put that off for 2 years because I thought, who's going to listen to what I have to say? The It's so saturated with apologetics that's out there. How would I ever stand out from anybody else? But if you know what you're talking about, and I'm not saying I know exactly everything that I'm talking about all the time, like I'm an expert, but if you know what you're talking about and you can make good arguments, you will stand out, and you will find some recognition, and that recognition could lead to relationships that you can build with other people. And that's, I think, one thing that's really helped me is by starting out and taking that first step with the blog, it made me more comfortable to begin to do other things, like video. You could try something like a podcast or something simple like that. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go about doing these things without having to show your face and do everything. You don't have to have the most outgoing personality. Um, so those are just kind of good baby steps that I would recommend, perhaps. And then, as Tyson said, be involved in your local church, and have that as well, and just be looking for the opportunities there. Talk to your pastor even, and let them know like your interest and that you're passionate about this particular subject. Don't go in there and demand and say, hey, give me a class and an opportunity to teach people. But just let your pastor know that your pastor should know your gifts and your talents and your abilities. He should at least be aware of them. Okay. And then prove yourself faithful over time, and your pastor will give you those opportunities as he sees maturity and different things developing in you. But if he doesn't even know that you have those interests in the first place, he's not going to get it unless he has some sort of miraculous revelation. And so be in communication with your spiritual leaders and authorities who are in your church, and just let them know what you're interested in, what you're learning, and how you'd like to serve God with it. And they'll know when to call on you when the time comes, and to have that opportunity as well. And so those are just a couple of things there. So excellent question, Ho. I really appreciate that. And so probably wrapping up here, I wanted to get some more practical advice for people who are just trying to get started out. And so for me, I felt totally overwhelmed. The reason why I got interested in apologetics is the conversation shifted to spiritual things on the job with a couple of guys that I was working with while we were eating lunch. Both of these guys were extremely well educated, and all I had was like my Bible school background, and somehow things got on spiritual things, and I tried to share with them, and I just got shot to shreds, and I didn't really know how to answer their objections. And so I started looking, and that's how I found out about Dr. Craig and Reasonable Faith and all of that other stuff. And it was just like I was just learning from what I could there, but I just felt so overwhelmed. Because Dr. Craig, he's got like 2 doctorates, and I'm thinking, do I have to get 2 doctorates? I'm really passionate about this, and there's just so many different things to learn, and I didn't have the time or the money to get a degree. So how can people hone in and begin to learn these things without getting overwhelmed, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's just true. There's, the more you learn about apologetics, the more you realize that there's just no way to master all of it. There's just so much more than anybody can learn in a lifetime. So there's a ton of information. So you really have to develop skills to sift through all of that. But again, this is why community is so important, right? We don't all need to be masters in everything. We can rely on each other to help fill the gaps. And so we need people who are $1 apologists, as J. Warner Wallace would say, and we need people who are $100 apologists. God's going to use all of that. I do want to say, for people who are wanting to take first steps into apologetics and maybe don't have a ton of resources to get, higher education. It's not necessary actually these days because so much information is available online for free. You could just go to the Reasonable Faith website, and that's a treasure trove of information. I mean,
Oh yeah.
there are people that spend tens of thousands of dollars to get the type of education that you could get from just reading Dr. Craig's articles. Um, so here are some good first steps to being a good apologist. Number one, read through your Bible at least once to get an idea of where you stand doctrinally. You should not be trying to defend a faith that you really can't even articulate. So read through your Bible, develop an idea of where you stand doctrinally on points of the Christian faith. Second, get a good bird's eye view of the apologetics landscape. There's a lot of arguments out there, a lot of objections, a lot of different directions you can go. There are some good books that give an overview or a survey of apologetics options, different arguments and approaches. So, On Guard by William Lane Craig is a good sort of beginner book. Christian Apologetics by Doug Groothuis. That's just like a really broad strokes overview. Love Your God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland, another good intro book. So there's some good resources out there that can give you a bird's eye view of the apologetics landscape. That was number two. Number three, find an area of apologetics that's really interesting to you or which you find to be greatly important. And then devote more time to learning that area in greater depth. Like I said, we don't need generalists across the board. And, we don't need all apologists to be generalists and to know about all of the different arguments. We need more specialists out there who delve more deeply into a particular argument or field of study. They're going to be more impactful in the long run than the generalists who are just popularizing the work that's already out there. And the specialists are the ones who are going to be pushing the arguments forward for future generations, incorporating new information and sharpening things that have been around for a while.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's number three is finding an area that you can go more deeply in. Number four, seek to reach a point where you are able to teach the material to others. Just hoarding the information for yourself is not healthy. That might help you in your own spiritual walk with the Lord to be confident in the truths of the Christian faith. But if you're not bringing other people with you or you're not strengthening other Christians, then you're really being selfish with the information that you're obtaining. So seek to reach a point where you can teach that material to others. And then finally, teach other people. So do lectures, do videos, write articles, make podcasts, publish books, have conversations with other people in your congregation, reach out to the unbelievers in your community by doing some street preaching. I don't know, just get out there and share the information that you learn. Those, I think, are some great first steps in being a good apologist.
Yeah, definitely. So in my case, I vented this concern on the Christian Apologetics Alliance Facebook group, which has been around for quite some time. And that's how I got in contact with Tim McGrew. It was me and a few other people kind of vented the same thing because somebody who has kids and doesn't really have the time or the money to go back and get like an advanced degree or something like that. He just kind of was able to take me under his wing a little bit and just kind of give me a lay of the landscape, like you said there, as far as he gave me a ton of books to read, a lot of which are older books that you can just get online for free because they're public domain. But just knowing what to say in certain areas in a general sense. And so there's positive and negative apologetics, and we don't have to get into all the grimy details, but basically there's a lot of things that are always going to come up. So you need to have something to say about the problem of evil. So you at least need to get some basic understanding of what the problem of evil is and what people have said about it. And if that particular area really lights your fire, for some reason, really dive deep into the problem of evil, and we could use people who specialize on answering the problem of evil. But get an overall understanding of what the common objections are. Divine hiddenness is something that always comes up. And so learn what atheists say about divine hiddenness, learn what Christians have said in response to that, learn about Hume's argument against miracles and what Christians have said in response to that. People are always bringing up, well, science eliminates the need for God. And so find some good books and materials about that. I think John Lennox has a book on a few good books on that particular topic. And so find out as far as, and then on the negative side of things too, like what do people say against the Bible? What are some of the moral objections that they have to scriptures? What are some of the other objections they have to scriptures, like maybe contradictions or different things like that? And so those are some of the main areas there. And then on the positive case, one of the things that Dr. McGrew encouraged me is like, don't feel like you have to learn every single argument for the existence of God. Find one that like actually interests you. So for me, it was always the moral argument because I don't do math. My son does math. My son can do circles around me with math. He's even has his own little YouTube channel on math. He's weird. Okay, so him and my grandfather, who's an engineer, will sit and argue about math, and I'm just like, I don't understand what you guys are talking about. I feel like that scene from Good Burger where it's like, I know some of those words, and so like I can't keep up. So me learning the kalam and about, I mean, I know the basics enough of the kalam. I had to learn enough just to become a chapter director. You got to be able to have a basic understanding of it. But getting into all the nitty gritty details about infinities and all of those other things, I can get a basic understanding of it. But the moral argument is something that was just a little bit more intuitive and easy for me to grasp, right? Maybe physics is your thing. So learning something like the fine tuning argument would be something good for you. For my son, I encourage him read what Dr. Craig has said about the Kalam cosmological argument, because that's probably where you're going to be the most interested. Learn about his argument for mathematics. I showed him the video that Reasonable Faith did for that, and he thought that was really cool, and so find the areas that really interest you. For me, telling off on myself, I was a mess of a high school student. I was too busy like running around doing crazy things and getting high before school. But I could always ace my history test, no matter if I studied or not, no matter if I came to class sober or not. History is just something that I always gravitated towards, and it comes easy to me, comes natural to me. And so I focus all my energy, as you guys know from watching this channel, on historical apologetics, because that's what's most interesting to me. If you are going to defend the Christian faith, then you at least need to have a decent knowledge of historical apologetics, because the resurrection is the linchpin of Christianity. And so at least have a basic argument down. And so, but I guess what I'm trying to say, and that was a bit on the long-winded side, but get a general understanding of the basic arguments for and against Christianity, master, or at least try to get good at one particular argument for the existence of God, and then try and at least get a basic case for the resurrection under your belt. And you can do it. The resources are out there. And from there, branch out into your expertise, right? I mentioned John McCrae. What he's doing is cultural apologetics. It's obviously where he fits. And so that's like good for him. You see somebody like a brain like Josh Rasmussen, or even like that guy's obviously, he's the contingency argument master. I mean, that's just who he is, and we need people like that. And everybody's a little bit different, so just find what fits you. So
I guess this is a good place to mention that John McCrae recently announced that he's going to be having a discussion with Michaela Peterson on the Unbelievable podcast. So that's a huge, I mean, he went from, just creating the channel a few years ago to getting hundreds of thousands of millions of views on his channel. and that now he's, interviewing Jordan Peterson's daughter, or in conversation with her, soon to be on the Unbelievable podcast. So,
Yeah.
yeah, he's not delving super deep into any of these issues, but
Mhm.
he's maximizing the amount of knowledge that he has to speak on these cultural topics in a way that God has called him to.
Right.
So yeah, it's crazy what God's doing through him right now too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I saw that too. I was like, whoa, that's
Yeah.
good for John. So um I think
Just real quick, one more thing.
yeah,
Sorry. So you
yeah, no, you're
mentioned
good.
kind of a little bit earlier that people should get a general overview of apologetics, because there are certain things that are kind of come up over and over again. So there's this quote by George Horne, from, he lived back in the 1700s,
Oh,
and
you're
I
already
love this
talking my
quote.
language with these old dead apologists right
I
there.
know, I know, and
As a McGroupie, I'm like, oh yeah, George Horn, he's one of my
yeah,
faves.
I'm
So
I'm 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 reading this quote from the Library of Historical Apologetics right now. So I mean, I got, we can keep plugging.
yeah,
But George Horne, I mean, this quote is just fantastic because every apologist can identify with this. Okay, he says, "Pertness and ignorance may ask a question in 3 lines, which it will cost learning and ingenuity 30 pages to answer.
mhm,
And when this is done, the same question shall be triumphantly asked again the next year, as if nothing had ever been written upon the subject." So he's
yeah,
like, even back in the 1700s, he's like, somebody's going to throw out this objection, this really short objection, and you're going to do the research and, careful thought that it takes to answer it in, with some nuance and sufficiently. And it doesn't matter, because the next year somebody's going to come along and ask that same thing, as if you hadn't done anything, you hadn't done the research, you hadn't done the thinking on the topic.
mhm,
So I think this is why, we see this. He was living in the 1700s and they were dealing with this. This is just part of doing apologetics, is kind of being prepared to answer these same tired objections over and over. And if you have a sufficient understanding of the apologetics landscape, it becomes much more easy to give a quick answer rather than having to elaborate as much as you did the first time. Yeah, I've found that, doing apologetics for a while, you begin to remember the citations, you begin to remember the sources and the layout of the argument much better. You're able to offer those answers much more quickly, and the faster you're able to come up with that information, the more credible you seem. People are suddenly like, wow, he answered that so quickly, that's just amazing.
mhm.
But a lot of that is just training yourself and going over and being able to answer these objections time and time again.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it is that quote reminds me of every time a Holy Kool-Aid video comes out again, and he's throwing out the same standard Bible contradictions or something, and I'm just like, oh man, I don't have time for this.
Go
Now
again.
you're wrecking my day, man. Stop. And so isn't there like playlist answering all of this on other people's channels already? Like, did Inspiring Philosophy make a video about these specific contradictions already? Anyway, I'll get off of that. And
Kind of
so,
reminds me of when Dr. Craig was in that dialogue with Jordan Peterson and Rebecca Newberger Goldstein. And Newberger
classic moment.
Goldstein, she's like suddenly breaks out the Euthyphro dilemma as if nobody's ever heard of it before, and there's going to be
Yeah,
some, knockdown argument. And Dr. Craig was like, "Really?
yeah,
Euthyphro dilemma?
yeah. Now, here we go again. And so,
Here we go
yeah.
again."
So wrapping up here, and I do have a question. Rob Tyson, thank you for your super chat. Let me get to you in 1 second here. That kind of ties into to my next point here, and then I want you to tell us if we've been talking about how we could get involved. I definitely want you to be able to talk about reasonable faith and how somebody might be involved in either joining a chapter or maybe even starting a chapter. And so I brought up YouTube. I brought up Holy Kool-Aid. And there's all these other guys that are out there. And so one thing that I have found is that I see a lot of people who are at least kind of have a general interest in this stuff, and it kind of goes back to wasting too much time online. Is they think, well, the truth is the truth, and so I can listen to all of these atheist channels and podcasts and just completely inundate myself with this bad information, because if the truth is the truth, it'll stand. And it doesn't matter how much I expose to myself to this. And then I'll get emails, and then I'll get questions and comments from people. And I work with Jonathan McClatchy's Talk About Doubts ministry. Some of these people, not all of them that we get, will just overwhelm themselves with too much of the negative case, because we've said this, well, all truth is God's truth, and the truth will always stand up. You don't need to be afraid of the truth. And so they'll overwhelm these things too soon, I think. I don't know if you've noticed this, Tyson. What advice do you have to a person who is just maybe throwing themselves too much towards the negative case all at once?
I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of affective influence there is in our lives, where things that aren't necessarily intellectual can affect how we perceive the world. And so, like, it's kind of like, the type of music that you listen to. If you're always listening to really dark, dreary music, you're probably not going to feel super chipper and happy all the time, right? It's
Right.
going to affect your mood. And the same kind of goes with, just watching atheist videos all the time. You're going to eventually, perhaps subconsciously or subliminally, be affected by that, especially if you're not getting a healthy dose of the other side, the other perspective. It's a lot like getting into boxing or MMA. Doing a little bit of training, and then deciding, hey, I want to get in the ring with a pro. There are really sophisticated atheists out there that can twist novice apologists into knots. And without getting that balanced counter perspective, you can really shipwreck your faith by immersing yourself in atheist literature or videos or content.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, of course, if you're getting into the ring with a pro and you're a novice, you can expect to get knocked out. That just goes with the territory. So it's the same with apologetics. Constantly exposing yourself to atheist content without also learning the counter arguments from the atheist side is going to be dangerous. And a great verse that kind of goes along with this, Proverbs 18:17, says, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him."
Yeah.
Right? So don't just be immersing yourself in atheist content, because that's not going to give you a full picture of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've just seen people weakened by that because they're spending almost too much time on that. And it's like you're two things is one, um, First Peter talks about faith being precious like gold, refined that's in a fire. And so it's not like we don't want to expose ourselves to these things and allow ourselves to have our faith refined. But if you haven't immersed yourself in the case for Christianity first, and the case for the existence of God first, um, then these things are going to come across a lot stronger than maybe that they really actually are. And if your faith is precious and it is valuable, then faith is worth guarding, and faith is worth holding on to. And I'm not saying just, shut your mind off and don't ever listen to these things. But if you haven't steeped yourself into those things, you're not going to be able to see through some of the mistakes or the fallacies that some of these people are making. I read Bart Ehrman. I read people that I disagree with. I'm reading Dale Allison's book on the resurrection, which can be helpful in some ways and not helpful towards the case of the resurrection for some people in other ways in terms of establishing it. He doesn't necessarily think that it can be established. And so, like I said earlier, I think Christians should read Graham Oppy and Paul Draper as far as these philosophical things. But I don't suggest that somebody who's new to these things just immerse themselves in these things, because you're going to get overwhelmed with too much too fast. And if faith is valuable, then you should be protecting it. And putting a ton of investment in at least hearing the best side for your faith first. And then you can get into those things when you're stronger. Don't overestimate your own strength, I guess, is what I'm saying. Again, that just goes back to the pride issue. And so really steep yourself, especially in the historical arguments. Uh, a few just beginner level books would be like The Case for Jesus by Brant Petra, Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams, Hidden in Plain View by Lydia McGrew. And then just really all of her books will get you more established in the Gospels. And then, just read Reasonable Faith by Dr. Craig is a really good one. It's actually pretty rigorous, and he's interacting with a lot of these guys. Then go back to that. So anyway, real quick,
I would also
go ahead.
suggest,
Yep.
like watching Dr. Craig debates and
Yeah.
McGrew debates, right?
Yeah.
There you have real-time interaction between atheists and Christians where you get to see the strongest of both sides, or
Mhm.
perhaps you can see not the strongest, but the most rhetorical, and
Yeah.
trying to learn, how argument goes. One of my best friends, he lives in North Carolina. I turned him on to Dr. Craig's debates, and he has a long commute. So he watched the opening, Lawrence Krauss's opening, when he debated Dr. Craig on his way to work, and he wasn't able to hear Dr. Craig's rebuttal before getting to work. So all day he's heard, he had just heard Lawrence Krauss's opening, and he was like, oh no, how is Dr. Craig possibly going to respond to this? And he was kind of freaking out. He's like, oh no. And then on the drive home, he listened to Dr. Craig's rebuttal, and he was like, oh wow, this is amazing. So yeah, that's just kind of the shock that people can get from hearing the atheist side for the first time, or maybe, in a way that's rhetorically powerful. It's important to hear them in conversation with Christians who actually know what they're talking about, because maybe you'll begin to see that the rhetoric is making things sound a little more powerful than it actually is.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me of this is one of my favorite Bible verses on apologetics. This is Acts 18:27-28. And it said, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. It says, when he arrived, he was of great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. And so listening to debates can actually be very, very strengthening. It says that it was great help to those that believed, because they're hearing the tough arguments that people are bringing, but then in that debate, somebody else is answering those tough arguments, and you're just like, whoa, like this absolutely can be answered. And I remember having that kind of moment when I first came across Dr. Craig. Is just like, it's like, this is tough stuff that I don't really know what to say. And what is he going to say? And it's just like, oh, whoa. And like, I think Dr. Craig says for some people, it can almost be like a power encounter, it's
Yeah.
just like, oh, this stuff can absolutely be answered. And so, yeah, that can definitely be strengthening as well. So we're going to wrap up here, but I got a quick super chat. This is Rob Tyson. He says, how do you respond to a skeptic who says they will not believe in God until they have a personal revelation of God? In other words, a face-to-face with God, they usually reject all other evidence. So Tyson, what do you say to that?
I would say I'm not even confident that they know themselves well enough to know that they would believe. Um, we have, in the Bible, the story from Jesus about Lazarus and the rich man, where the rich man is suffering and asks Lazarus to dip his finger in water to give him some relief. And then he asks, to send somebody to his brothers to let them know the truth, that he doesn't want them to join him in misery. And Lazarus says, I'm not going to send any, or we're not going to send anybody, because even, if they didn't believe Moses, then they're not going to believe someone even if they rise from the dead. So there are people who, even if they have a personal encounter with God, they're not going to trust in God for their salvation and eternal life. So it's not just belief that God exists that God is after. God wants a personal relationship with people. And if a skeptic is open to that and genuinely seeking God, then God will provide sufficient evidence for him, either in general revelation or special revelation.
Mhm.
But if he is not genuinely open to having that relationship with God, then God is under no obligation to offer more evidence than he has given.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I would say to somebody like that, again, the first thing that sticks out to me is they wouldn't believe in God. Again, belief. I mean, James says even the demons believe and tremble. So belief doesn't bring somebody into a saving faith. And so it just kind of makes me wonder how open this person is to begin with. Now, I would say something like a claim like the resurrection. Sure, that should require more evidence to believe than just any other particular claim. And so you should have more evidence for the resurrection, but it doesn't necessarily mean that no evidence can be submitted like whatsoever or something like that. And so because something like the resurrection would indeed be an object of sense. And so if there is more evidence for the hypothesis than there is against it, and then there's no good reason to reject it. It sounds to me like they probably have not heard that case yet, or heard it well. And so I would ask them, if I were to be able to give you that case, would you be open to it? And if they still kind of dig in their heels and stick with their guns, then I would kind of question really how open they are at first to begin with. It just seems to me like it's a little bit on the more unreasonable side of things. And so um, all right. Well, Tyson, we've gone longer than I had anticipated by about 40 minutes. So, but I really appreciate you taking the extra time, and I don't want to keep you away from your family. But we've been talking about how to get involved, and one great way to get involved is through the chapters. Now, there are chapters pretty much in a lot of places. They're not everywhere, but they're in a lot of places. And so, how can somebody first of all find out if there is a chapter in their area, and then if somebody is interested in maybe starting a chapter, what advice do you have for them, and how can they get involved?
Yeah, so we do have a chapters directory on the website. I see you have the link down there at the bottom of the screen scrolling,
High tech.
reasonablefaith.org/chapters. You can go there to see the chapters that already exist. And if there's not one in your area, or your area is heavily populated and can use another one, and you're interested in starting one, we're more than happy to open another one. So if that's a way that you think that God might be leading you to serve and help get into the apologetics community, then you can go to the chapters page on the Reasonable Faith website to see all of the information about starting a chapter. Basically, the process is very simple, actually. You complete the online application and you read the Reasonable Faith book, complete the study guide for that book, and I send everyone a free copy of the study guide. You submit your testimony of how you came to Christ and what your walk with Him looks like today, and then contact information for two references, one being a pastor or ministry leader at a church that you've attended in the last 5 years. And really, that's it. If you can get through all of those, then you can be a Reasonable Faith chapter director. And of course, we require agreement with Reasonable Faith's theological distinctives. It's basically mere Christianity with an evangelical doctrine of salvation. So, interestingly, we have Catholic and Orthodox chapter directors who have affirmed the Reasonable Faith theological distinctives. So I don't know how they square that with their church's teachings, but that's up to them, right? They are affirming our theological distinctives, and so they may be qualified for Reasonable Faith chapter director. Yeah, so there is no age restriction, there's no education restriction, nothing like that. So pretty much anyone who can get through the certification process can be a Reasonable Faith chapter director. And I just have to say, it's been amazing seeing just how God has used these reasonable faith chapters. We've had chapters open up in such remote regions as Kathmandu, Nepal, and we just opened one in Vietnam recently, and one
Wow.
in Jos, Nigeria. Just places where we didn't even know there were apologists,
Yeah.
and they're getting through the certification process and um, sharing this information with very remote regions. And so, yeah, you can get involved in this way. It's very simple, and there's a lot of help if you need help to get through it as well. And then just another plug I want to make before we get done is another thing that I do for Reasonable Faith is I'm the director of translations. So we have tons of translations projects getting apologetics material into other languages. If you or someone you know is interested in getting into the translation side of things, that is a huge need, something that we're always trying to push because this information is mainly in English right now. We want it to be available to the world, and so that means translating it into other languages. So please contact me if you'd like to get involved with that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. So, well, there you have it. You don't even have to be a Molinist to apply, guys. I'm just no Arians though. And I had some Arians in the comment the other day. You know who you are if you're watching. Get your doctrine together, buddy.
Not cool, dude.
No,
Not
no,
cool.
I'm just kidding. Yeah. So awesome. And so, yeah, definitely. It's absolutely worth going through the materials and study. And I think the face-to-face interaction that you can get, the online apologetics is like one thing, and I think it's good and I think it's important. But being able to have some face-to-face with people is definitely brings it all back down to earth. And so, well, awesome, man. Tyson, I really appreciate you taking the extra time and going over here with me. And hopefully this was helpful to you guys. And if it was, I'm going to do the cheesy YouTuber thing. Smash that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. But yeah, no, thank you so much, man, for coming on and just dropping some practical advice for people. I think this was super helpful.
It's a lot of fun, man. Time flies when you're having fun, and it was a great conversation. I hope it was helpful to a lot of people out there, and I hope we get to do it again sometime.
Yeah, man, I'd definitely love to. So, all right. Well, thank you guys so much for watching, and you guys have a good night.